What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Middle-earth Shadow of War. Sequel to, of course, Shadow of Mordor, both of which use the Nemesis system, which are what these games are primarily known for, since it never really got used again, and is, to be honest, the most unique thing about them. In the case of Shadow of War, it's a little bit interesting though, because I initially played this game when it released. It was a fairly different game back then, because it included a bunch of microtransactions stuff that later got removed. The studio that made it, Monolith, has since been shut down. And way back when, I was, not doing YouTube as a job at the time, and I knew eventually I wanted to get around to covering these games, and obviously now was the time. So when I played this game initially, I did the vast majority of it, but there were some achievements, some online stuff, and then the Desolation of Mordor DLC that I had never done. So some of that was actually unique experiences to this run through it for the review. And the nice thing about having played it both before and after all these changes is I can speak a little bit to that, though admittedly some of that is simply from memory. Speaking of, though, when I initially set out to go back and review Shadow of War and Shadow of Mordor, there was a little bit of confusion that I noticed about what was still apparent in each game. So the online stuff is still up and functional in Shadow of War. It all works as intended, all the achievements are obtainable, all that stuff. We'll talk about that in actually just a second, because if anything, I think they're easier to get now. However, Shadow of Mordor had its online component shut down, but before that happened, they changed the online achievements and stuff there to make sure they were still accessible to people. But in the case of Shadow of War, not only is the online still up, but everything is functioning as normal, can confirm. But I mentioned that some things actually seem to be easier now. Well, that is for, I would say, the simple reason that less people are playing it now. Which may sound a little counterintuitive for online stuff, but there weren't a ton of online achievements to begin with. And the online for this game has never actually required you to play directly with people, but rather interact with their orc armies and stuff that they have built up via the game's siege and conquest mechanics. There are other little missions like online vendettas that allow you to kill orcs that have killed other people. Those are just very simple little missions. For some reason, I had never done that, so I was able to jump in and do that really quickly. But the big thing is the online conquest. In particular, there's an achievement that sees you needing to reach the rank of captain here. I thought this was going to be a pain, and once I turned my full attention to it, it took maybe 2 or 3 hours. And the reason for that being is the way the game calculates its assault and defense ratings. The combination of which gives you your overall rating, which gives you the score. You need a score of 2,500 to get this achievement. If you get into the late game, basically what you can do is staff an entire fortress that you'll be taking over throughout the course of the game with high-level orcs, and then buy up all the upgrades. Do that for each of the 4 forts that count to your defense rating, and you can get somewhere in the ballpark of 18 to 2,000 just off of defense alone, which leaves the assault rating. Assault rating is ranked. It basically sees you conquering fortresses of other players, and if you do it really, really quickly, you'll get a plus 100 rating, and because the defense rating is so high, you only need to win a couple of those conquests. The thing is, just by going through the main story, you'll have a very small assault rating, and because the game is ranked, it matches you with players with a fortress that also has an equally low rating, which means at max level, you'll be able to just plow through those super easily, win a couple of them, ta-da, the achievement is yours. In the past, this was more difficult because people can attack your forts and stuff too, and you lose a little bit of defense rating, and when there were more people playing it, those ratings fluctuated a lot more. It was actually super simple to do this time around, because it is so much more static where not as many people are playing. And you don't actually need them to be playing in order to interact with the fortresses and stuff. The game just pulls that information from the people who have played previously. So again, not only are these available, but if anything, I think they were easier now. And then of course, there's the microtransaction stuff. So somewhat famously, or perhaps infamously would be the right word, this game launched with a bunch of microtransactions. It was kind of annoyingly difficult to get your hands on good orcs to dominate, to fill the ranks of your armies with, which the game itself actually kind of stretched out the main story with via the Shadow War section of the main story, which we'll talk about, but basically it's a long siege and conquest thing that could have been made faster if it weren't for them stretching it out in order to put the microtransactions in there and try to get you to, of course, buy them. Those microtransactions would both give you orcs and the ability to upgrade them, which would make that process faster. You don't have to worry about any of that anymore. That's all been removed, which is great. But realistically, that's only a small part of Shadow of War, because the biggest thing is by far its Nemesis system. And because this is an iteration of its debut in Shadow of Mordor, we actually see a bunch of iterations upon it. Of course, the Siege and Conquest system, which is new to this game, but also expansions in other ways, like different ways you can interact with orcs, dividing them up into a bunch of tribes, which all have their own like advanced classes and stuff. The addition of the Olugahai, or like the half-trolls, but also the expansion of even just the narrative and the questing and the side stuff. Shadow of Mordor is a very short game, and while Shadow of War does not have like a terribly long main story or anything, it's definitely a much more robust game where you can feel them hitting their stride with the system overall, and I think it really shows. And if you enjoy that system, I think this game is great. If that's not your thing, I honestly don't think the game has much else to offer you. But for me, just seeing the interactions of the Nemesis system, seeing it build up all these different types of orcs and how you can interact with them and pitting them against each other, and using that to both refine and empower your own armies by dominating and controlling them, just works in such a unique way that unfortunately, due to a variety of different reasons, we've never really seen again. Now, inevitably, people are going to comment about how the Nemesis system was patented and then Monolith has shut down and everything. And yes, that patent is seemingly on shaky legal ground to begin with, but I am not a lawyer. And moreover, even if that is the case, most studios aren't going to want to fight a legal battle and also try to make a game at the same time. And so nobody's ever really pushed them on it. Which leaves us with Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War having this really unique system that I think could apply to so many other things. But for now, we can only play these games and dream what they might have been. But in the case of Shadow of War, it's also just a really fun game, so there is that. And it was honestly just a delight to come back to this after not having played it in so many years, especially because, again, some of the stuff that I remembered being more difficult was made much more easy. One of the achievements I did not have from my initial time playing it was an achievement called Trolling, which sees you need to use an Olugahai in order to kill a captain, or one of the orcs you can dominate, which is a little tricky and either requires you to get insanely lucky with some RNG spawns, or to utilize a couple of different methods in order to force this situation to occur. There has actually been a mission that was discovered that is a guaranteed spawn between an Olugahai and a regular captain that you can just repeat and do it that way, which is one way. But in this case, I had actually planned to do it that way, but through the Nemesis system and its iterations, I actually kind of just lucked into the exact situation I needed to easily get that achievement just by playing the game normally, which was a blast. And little moments like that where this system, again, just creates like an emergent situation for you to deal with is really the highlight of the game. That's why I wanted to share that little anecdote. But with all of that stuff out of the way, let's of course talk about the rest of the game. Starting with the technical state. How is this game running in 2026, despite releasing all the way back in 2017 at the end of it, I believe? And the answer is mostly pretty good. I did have a couple of crashes. This time around, I spent roughly 35, 40-ish hours with it, and I had played like 40 or 50 hours previously. I don't remember exactly. But nothing too bad. Now, I will say, unfortunately, the controls are still a little wonky. It does that thing that, honestly, I see in Assassin's Creed a lot, where there's such an emphasis on, like, parkour and climbing that sometimes your character is just a little too eager to try to climb everything when you were just trying to walk by it. So occasionally you'll find something on a corner, and it's actually, like, weirdly difficult to get to because Talion, our main character, wants to, like, parkour his way around everywhere, but just instead of just walking up to that spot, and it gets a little old sometimes. But barring things like that, it's a game that seems to be running pretty well. Again, the online stuff is still up, but I would be surprised if you had too much trouble running this one. Keeping it moving, let's talk next about the difficulty of this game. So, this game does have a few different difficulties, and they basically determine how hard the combat is going to be. This is from easy, normal, into like Nemesis and Gravewalker, and this impacts a few different things like the overall level of the orcs you are likely to encounter, which is going to, of course, make them stronger stronger, but it can also affect the things that roll onto those orcs. Like, for instance, when an orc initially takes you down to 0 health, you enter what is called Last Chance mode. You can have up to, I believe it's 3 of these at a max, where you can basically just win a little quick time event that's really easy in order to continue fighting, which is their way of combating the fact that there's a lot of numbers and sometimes you can be thrown into unfair situations. On higher difficulties, you can find more orcs that have an ability called No Chance, which just completely negates your ability to do a last chance. There's also an option in game for occasionally getting an orc who will just come in and save you from an orc that's about to kill you this way. Like, they'll just fully kill the one trying to kill you in a bizarre situation. So you have some difficulty options if you are not loving the baseline. However, I did also want to mention that in the DLC I had not played, Desolation of Mordor, the difficulty there plays a role in the score. And in fact, if you want to take the difficulty just barely up to Nemesis, which is just above normal, it's actually incredibly easy to get the gold rating achievement for that DLC, which I figured I'd mention here, but we'll talk more about that in a bit. Because next up, I want to talk about the story setup for this game. The story for Shadow of War is really interesting in the sense that it is not canon in any way, but also I really enjoy it. And I enjoy it because Talion's story in particular is just an incredible tragedy. And Shadow of War, I think, really highlights that. Coming from Shadow of Mordor, after successfully getting your initial bit of revenge, you and Celebrimbor, the elf who has turned into a wraith and is keeping you, Talion, alive after your unceremonious death at the beginning of the first game, together forge the new ring, another ring of power that is allowing you to dominate all of these orcs and try to take the fight to Sauron directly. This splinters off into a few different directions, namely I would say it's an examination of power and domination and how, if you're not careful, there is precious little difference about which side of this perpetual war you happen to find yourself on. And there are, I think, some great moments with how Talion himself is presented. And while it's not like an incredible narrative or anything, I don't want to oversell the story to you. It's just something that resonated with me personally. It's also, I think, a lot better than Shadow of Mordor, who had an incredibly bare-bones story and was very short in comparison. And then, of course, they start bringing in other characters like Eltariel and how she's taking the fight to the Nazgul, and there is some stuff to enjoy there. Now, where I do think the story falls apart a bit is towards the end of it with the Shadow War, which is effectively just past the point of no return. The game has a basic ending and then a true ending. If you want the true ending, you have to go through the Shadow War. It's less of a pain these days, thanks to changes that were made to like the XP system and stuff to coincide with the removal of the microtransactions, etc. So it's easier to do, but the Shadow War is like a really long slog of just these conquest missions, and it gets old fast. Though does probably show off the, I would say, very long-haul war that Talion finds himself fighting in order to, of course, stave off Sauron and, in theory, allow the events of the main series to actually happen, but again, none of this is really canon. But broad strokes, without spoiling absolutely everything, I enjoyed the story of this one. It always kind of spoke to me personally, but I also am not, I would say, convinced that it's actually that good. I think I just like it a lot. Which then brings us into the progression systems. So progression in this game, Shadow of War, is like many of a third-person action RPG, I would describe as a little unsure of itself. It really tries to like bring in these RPG elements that I don't think always quite fit, and that is really noticeable with the gear system. But progression itself is more or less just your level, the gear, the gems and stuff you put into it, and then side stuff like building up your orc armies in each region, and then I guess like the online rating if you want to include that. But levels and skills are really simple. As you level up and complete certain objectives and missions and things like that here and there, you will earn skill points. As you level up and get those skill points, you will unlock various skills. You have a base skill, and then that skill can have one of 3 upgrades active at a time. Some of those skills are locked behind both story progression or side quest progression, and you'll need to do those if you want to use those skills. And what's really interesting here is while unlocking a lot of the base skills will allow combat to be easier in general, a lot of the mutually exclusive upgrades allow you to fine-tune your approach to, say, a specific orc if you want. So you can, pretty freely for the most part, swap out those skills whenever you want, and that's really helpful for fighting an orc that might, say, have immunities to your normal approach, and then you can just switch some skills around and take a different approach. And there is a little bit of customization there, but a lot of it hinges around the gear as well. Gear is where I think the progression of this game goes a little bit wrong. So there's a lot of gear to find, and a lot of it has stats that just never really feel all that impactful. There are gear rarities, and you also have your items from the original game represented as gear pieces that upgrade and follow you throughout the story. Most gear, that is to say common, uncommon, rare, epic, all that stuff, typically has a way to be upgraded, like a little challenge you can complete, and then you can spend a little bit of your currency to upgrade it, which will give it a couple extra levels, and then also activate the secondary effect. The problem is those secondary effects are rarely super impactful in comparison to all the skills and upgrades you can get anyway, but then there are the legendary gear sets. So the legendary gear are basically sets of gear associated with mostly the tribes of orcs you'll run into, but also for stuff like the online system, and the challenges for those pieces of gear see you recruiting a specific type of orc in order to upgrade that piece of gear. The legendary gear sets actually do come with like set bonuses and stuff that are more interesting than the base gear abilities, but even then you have to put a fair bit of work into upgrading those gear pieces to keep them useful. But honestly, unless you're playing on the higher difficulties, you don't need to worry about that at all. Just find gear that's your level and it really will not matter. And because of that, the gear system always felt like a little out of place here for me, especially when you add the gem system on top of it. So there are 3 different gems, each with like a tier of effect, if you will, as you refine the gems and increase them. These can do things like increase your damage with all attacks, increase the level of the orcs you recruit, give you some life steal, stuff like that. And to be honest with you, the gems in many ways feel more impactful than the gear you are often attaching it to. And so, all told, is the gear system bad? No, absolutely not. I just also don't think it really fits the game, especially after they took all the microtransactions out. Because, if you didn't know, the orcs you would get from the microtransactions could be destroyed and turned into gear. And that was also, in addition to the orcs, just a really convenient way to get better gear than you would likely find just by running through the game. So, that is pretty much it. The 2 major DLCs have slightly different progression, but that is sort of the baseline. Which then brings us to the gameplay and world section, before we also probably rope it into combat with the Nemesis system. But the gameplay and the world is relatively simple. It's kind of just an expanded version of the original title, if you'd believe it. So instead of 2 regions, we have 5, I think, by default, and then the addition of Lithlad with the Desolation of Mordor. So in the base game, we had Minas Ithil or Minas Morgul, and I am absolutely going to mispronounce some of these just so you're aware. And then the other ones like Cirith Ungol or something like that. Nurnen, Saragost, and Gorgoroth, each kind of giving you a different biome and vibe to run around in and do all of your regular activities. The Desolation of Mordor DLC, in addition to providing an entirely new game mode, brought its region of Lithlad, which is like a deserty area, into the main game as well. And while it's not related to story progression at all, you can run around there as Talion and fight the fortress and everything if you so choose. Regardless, in all of those zones, you are going to find, for the most part anyway, 3 Haydir, as they are called. These are basically towers from which you can observe, and this is how you'll get an idea of where all of like the collectibles and stuff in the zone are. Very traditional like open world type of thing to do, really. But some of the things you will discover this way are the Gondorian artifacts, which can give you some background about, the world itself if you aren't super familiar with it. There are also these elven words you can find, which will then unlock a door in the given region, and that's a way you will get access to one of the main gear sets you can get a hold of. You can also pick up Shelob's memories. Shelob plays a role in the main story a lot in this one. I don't really want to spoil it exactly. Again, not really canon at all, but I really do like the way they portrayed her in this game. Though, again, not really true to her character in many ways, I would say. And then, of course, there are various side quests, which will typically see you practicing some element of the combat, or in the case of this game, just actual regular side quests, which will follow some of the Nemesis system stuff with one of the initial orcs you'll fight, a guy named Bruce. Eltariel, the Blade of Galadriel, will have some quests for you as well, which relate to the main story, actually. And then you can even follow up on the Gondorians you'll be helping along the way. Though, truth be told, I think they are just to kind of show off some of Talion's humanity as he has succumbed to his undeath. And yet, as you experience all of that stuff, realistically, the highlight is the Nemesis and combat systems. So first, let's talk about the Nemesis system, though it is honestly all kind of related. Probably one of the most immediately apparent things they did here was include the addition of siege missions and like defenses and having to build up your fortress and stuff, which plays a very large role in this game. So not only are we tackling an army of orcs made up of captains and war chiefs, but now we have an overlord of a region who controls the fortress there. You will need to conquer those fortresses repeatedly if you want to do the Shadow War part, and that really does see you taking the orcs and things you have accumulated and throwing them against the fortress and its defenders that are left. Now you'll have some options to weaken, of course, the armies of Sauron here in order to make that easier on yourself, which includes doing things like tracking down the war chiefs and killing them in order to disable the defenses of the fortress, killing all the captains you have not dominated to bring them over to your side to make the battle itself easier, as they are, of course, going to be your main shock troops before you fight the Overlord themselves. To make it more interesting, we also see betrayals. Orcs are a little more rebellious in this one, in the sense that they can overcome your domination and break free and betray you, which can be occasionally kind of annoying, but does add a certain element to things. So not only do you need to go around dominating these captains and whatnot, in order to get to their war chiefs, in order to take down the Overlord, you have all these new mechanics even beyond that with things like, again, the betrayals, the shame into the deranged status, just all sorts of stuff like that, realistically. The orc tribes as well play a role here. Each tribe kind of does its own thing and has its own aesthetic even, and that can play into some of the factors and traits that the individual orcs can get. The orcs themselves are divided up into common, epic, and legendary here. The epic and legendary orcs have extra traits, which allows them to do more. Via the game's mostly defunct now garrison system, you can interact with this a little bit farther actually by using training orders, which you can use your just normal in-game currency to get now, to pack them up, move them to different regions and have them be useful to you elsewhere. So if you find like a really great orc but you don't want to use them in this region, you can use the garrison system to move that orc somewhere else. And you can also use those same training orders to strengthen those orcs. So you can get these training orders that will just flatly increase the orc's level, or give them all sorts of unique types of different weapons, like, elemental weapons imbued with some power. You can give them a mount, you can give them a gang of followers, and just all sorts of stuff like that allow you to not only see different interactions with the orcs between themselves, but allows you to directly empower your army as you take on these guys. And I think that was a really cool element they added here. Then, of course, there is the return of all the base level Nemesis stuff, the ways you can pit them against each other. You can make orcs spies after you dominate them if they are, say, the bodyguard of a war chief, and then they'll turn on that war chief and make that fight easier for you. Some of them can be blood brothers, and they will have a special bond that will usually see them coming to each other's defense, or if you're really aching to get that achievement for making them kill each other, you can do that too by conquering a fortress and then assigning orcs to fight to the death in the fight pits, which is a good way to make the blood brothers fight each other. Or in my case, one of them will actually survive this with the cheating death thing, only to show up and attack me later for having made him fight his blood brother. So all of these systems combined just really allow you both to shape your own experience, but also experience the emergent systems of the Nemesis system itself. And while I think there could be further iterations to this stuff, it was such a promising system. Shadow of Mordor walked so Shadow of War could run, and it really is just such a fun thing to mess around with. Now, where it gets a little less exciting is, to be honest with you, the combat itself, because the actual combat that you participate in is not like super complicated or anything. It does, of course, have a fairly big focus on stealth. There are a bunch of like stealth kills, stealth brutalizes in general in order to spread terror among orcs and kind of make them flee from you. And as you gain experience and level up, you'll unlock more of your base level abilities that allow you to be more effective in general, but some of your big things are like your might and your focus. So by successfully performing combat actions, you will build up might. If you get hit a lot, you might lose it, but if you can build up might, you can occasionally unleash like instant executions against the fodder level orcs, if you will, or deal some bigger damage to the captains, whereas focus will let you slow down time with your ranged attacks. And then there are abilities that interact with this further that can replenish your focus and allow you to use this time longer. There are orcs that are of course, either mortally weak or simply very vulnerable to specific types of damage. Sometimes they're immune to things outright. And learning to cater your approach to the specific orc you are trying to fight is usually the way to go. The captains and the named orcs are usually not going to get one shot by stealth, but some of them can be, and you're going to learn that information by finding worms. Worms are basic level orcs that you can interrogate before you kill them in order to get information about the strengths and weaknesses of the orcs you're about to face. That is to say, the captains and everything. Now, another way they did actually expand this a little bit is by taking the flora and fauna of the world to a slightly bigger level. So the initial game, Shadow of Mordor, did also have the ability to, mount and use the wildlife of Mordor against the orcs. And that, of course, makes a return here. But Shadow of War sees you interacting with things like drakes or different types of graug, for instance. In fact, one of the more annoying achievements to get that, again, people have found a solution to was actually finding the different versions of graug, like poison or fire or frost. And just as a little aside, the reason this was an annoying achievement to mount every single type of wildlife that you could in this game, one of the graugs, the poison graug, only spawns as a sort of like rare spawn in the Nirnen area, whereas every other beast type has a guaranteed spawn in main missions or side missions, so they're relatively easy to find, and you'll have to like sort of try to force spawn the poison graug, which was a little annoying. But the drakes and the elemental graugs have the ability to spew their chosen element on the ground and just kind of has more interactions in general. The graug are a little less clunky to maneuver around the battlefield. The Caragors, of course, make their return. There are orcs that are weak to all of these things. But both the combat and the Nemesis system itself really revolve around tracking down the specific weaknesses of the orcs you are about to face and then capitalizing on those weaknesses by using bait to draw in beasts, attacking them via stealth, or using an element they take more damage from, that kind of thing. None of the combat is really mind-blowing. It's really just how you use the game's various systems to approach the specific combat situation that you find yourself in. And how much fun you get out of that is largely going to be down to you. But there is a lot of potential there to have really unique situations come up based on the orcs you are fighting, the way things go down, etc., etc. Just all those different interactions and the way they can play out. But all of that does bring us to the DLC section. So the DLC is most notably the Blade of Galadriel and the Desolation of Mordor. Now, I had played the Blade of Galadriel previously. It's fine, I guess. It just sees you taking up a little more story with Eltariel, the Blade of Galadriel, the elven woman that assists in some of the main story. This DLC in particular shows you some of her efforts to do her job, which is tracking down and fighting the Nazgul, or the Ringwraiths. She doesn't have to worry about things like the army management, etc. She's got a little bit of side quest in there as well, but in total it's like 3 or 4 hours. It's not going to take you very long. The more substantial and more interesting one is actually the Desolation of Mordor, which I had not played previously, which I'm glad to have finally got around to because I enjoyed this one quite a bit. It is, I would not exactly call it a roguelike mode, but it puts you in the role of a regular guy, Baranor, one of the survivors of the first part of the game, Minas Ithil. Here we see him meeting up with his brother, Circa, in Lithlad, where he's going to take the fight to the orcs himself this time around. This sees him meeting up with the dwarf Torvin from the original game, and you're going to basically track down and utilize a bunch of technology in order to fight these orcs as a regular guy, which includes things like a grappling hook, various types of bombs, and wrist-mounted crossbows and stuff to fight these guys. The orcs in this one drop augments, which can be used to augment your base level items and stuff per run, but some of this progression is actually permanent. The technological upgrades you find, as well as your base skill unlocks from these stories. But ultimately, the goal is simply to conquer all the outposts in the region, and then of course fight the Overlord here and take over the fortress as Baranor and his mercenaries. Now there is an achievement for this one, which is one of the rarest achievements for this one, mostly because it's DLC, I would imagine, called Baranor the Conqueror, which is doing this and getting a gold rating for doing so, which seems like it would be a little difficult, but is actually extraordinarily easy if you just turn the difficulty of the DLC up to the Nemesis difficulty, which is 1 step above normal. The reason being that doubles your score, and then you can do pretty bad at the DLC actually and easily clear the requirement for a gold rating. But honestly, I like this just for the shakeup of the mechanics and the different ways of fighting the orcs as Baranor and kind of utilizing those different contraptions and stuff. And even the little parachute glider you get access to, which all just kind of was a fun mix-up of the formula for me personally, especially having never experienced it before. But all of that does bring us to our Steam Deck section before we start wrapping this thing up. So this game is officially verified on the Steam Deck, which is not terribly surprising given both the genre of game that this is, but also the fact that this released in 2018 and its recommended specs are in fact a little bit below the core hardware for the Steam Deck itself. So it plays for the most part pretty well there. The only problem you might run into is with the servers and stuff. So if you want to connect to the online stuff, you might have some problems there trying to get it to connect because of the different platform and everything, at which point you might want to look up a guide or something, which is a little beyond the scope of this particular review. And it seems to be a little harsh on the battery of the thing regardless, but you know, if that stuff doesn't bother you or if you don't run into those issues, I guess, it's a pretty good place to play it. Which brings us to our positives and negatives. So the positives, realistically, are the Nemesis system. The most unique thing about this game by a lot. It is a refined and improved version of the original that I think really expands what the system is capable of, and given that you really can't experience it anywhere else, and this is the best version of it that we have seen, despite it being a few years old now, it's certainly the biggest reason to play this game by a lot. But I also think the expanded mechanics elsewhere were interesting. I don't necessarily love what they did with the gear system, but I also think the expansions of other stuff, like just, you know, in terms of exploration and even the way they messed around with some of the side quests and tried to bring in, of course, the Nemesis system even to those and see how they could interact, were a lot of fun. Again, the story really spoke to me personally. I don't think it's like the strongest story ever or anything, but I had a blast with it. I think Talion's story is a really great one, even if it is not canon. And those are, I think, by far the biggest reasons to pick this game up and play it, because it does have a fair few negatives, but it's not really that it has any big negatives. It's more of just like a lot of little things that can grate on you over time. Like the controls in various places. Talion's insistence on trying to parkour around everything when sometimes you're just trying to like walk up to something and occasionally that's like a weird hassle. I didn't mention it here, but it comes up a lot in this game. There are, when the orcs sort of interact with Talion for the first time, they give a couple of sentences and speeches, but the sieges and the conquest battles will introduce like 5 or 6 of these guys at once, which means you can be in the middle of a fight and suddenly all of these orcs have to spout their little intro message, which can, in particularly egregious cases, take like a minute to run through all of them, and that feels very silly. There's also, again, the gear system, which I don't love. I see what they were trying to do there, but I honestly don't think it works out very well. And I think this game would have been better off with either a simpler or way more expansive gear system. It tries to sit in like this weird middle ground that I don't think does the game any favors. If it were either simpler or more complex, I think it would be better either way. But this middle of the road thing it tries to do with its RPG mechanics and the challenge systems for those pieces of gear aren't fun to me, and they are not substantial enough to really add anything either. So again, the negatives for me, mostly just slight annoyances and the exact execution here and there, some quibbles and things, but I don't think they're the end of the world and they don't detract from the experience too much, which brings me to my conclusion. Middle-earth Shadow of War is, much like Shadow of Mordor, a game that does something I really value, which is it does something unique, which is, of course, its Nemesis system. It is really the only way to play it in its intended version, if you will. I think that system alone is worth recommending the game for, but in this particular case, I also think the ways they expanded it and tried to make the game bigger than what Mordor itself is really admirable, and for the most part I think it works out really well, and you have this, again, pretty unique experience if only for that system. And it's a real shame we haven't seen it elsewhere, and that Monolith got closed down and all those other things I've already mentioned, but if only for those reasons, I do think you should, if you haven't, eventually play this game for yourself. It weirdly has a demo on Steam still. And while the base game, especially the definitive edition with all the DLC, is still more or less full price, like $60 for all the DLC and everything, which is a little expensive, this game is also a little on the older side, coming up on 10 years in fact, which means you can find it on sale for very cheap, very regularly. I'm pretty sure it's been given away for free in a few places here and there. So, I mean, just on principle at this point, especially with Monolith being shut down, I would wait to pick it up on one of the bigger sales of the year, if nothing else, but I do think people should play this game for themselves at some point, because these systems are worth experiencing. But that is pretty much going to do it for this particular video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I would love to know what you think of this particular game down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.